Many years ago, I had my one and only experience of getting to hobnob with the upper crust of the political world at one of those $500 a plate dinners. It was back during my days as a corporate pilot. I was flying a Georgia businessman who had gotten well connected during the years that Jimmy Carter was in the White House. He owned a construction company that built a lot of subsidized low-income housing, and he saw political connections as essential to keeping his business going. The event in question was a 1983 gathering of the Democratic hopefuls for the '84 election. It included Jesse Jackson, John Glenn, Gary Hart, Reuben Askew, eventual nominee Walter Mondale, and many others. They were there primarily to curry favor with deep-pocketed supporters, my boss among them. And he had a big block of tickets for this event, and he offered me one, said I could tag along rather than just hanging out at the airport. Now, this businessman had spent a lot of time at the White House during the Carter years, and he'd gotten to know Walter Mondale fairly well. He liked him, thought of him as a friend. But he didn't think that Walter Mondale would be able to beat an incumbent Ronald Reagan. And so my boss went and sat down at Reuben Askew's table. Askew, the relatively conservative governor of Florida at the time, he saw as someone who might be able to stand up to Reagan. The disappointment at the Mondale table was palpable. Mondale had clearly expected my boss's support. He thought that their relationship would have given him an advantage. But for my boss, it wasn't about the relationship. It was about the connections. He needed a connection to the eventual winner. He even had his doubts that Askew could win, which turned out to be right. And so eventually he started to send money the Republican way as well. Now, there's nothing particularly remarkable about this story. Any astute political observer might have predicted what my boss did. It wasn't personal. It was a business decision. He needed those connections, and so he had to do what he had to do. I wonder if James and John are engaged in any sort of similar thought process when they go to Jesus looking for plum spots in his upcoming administration. Mark's gospel is clear that the disciples don't understand what's going on. Jesus has just told them for a third time that he will be arrested and humiliated and executed. But he's also said that he will rise again, so maybe James and John are focused on that. I don't know. James and John are part of Jesus' inner circle already. They'd been there on the mountaintop when Jesus was transfigured, and they saw him speaking with Moses and Elijah, and they heard the heavenly voice calling Jesus, "My Son, the Beloved." And everyone knows you're supposed to use those sort of connections to your own advantage. The other disciples are kind of ticked when they hear about this, about the little power play by James and John. But I wonder if they might well have done the same thing if they had gotten the opportunity. Maybe they're even a little jealous that they didn't think of it first. But Jesus, as he so often does, uses this as a teachable moment. Yes, this is how the world works, Jesus says, but not so among you. You must seek to be a servant For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. You know, you hear the term servant leader bandied about now and then, and elected officials are sometimes referred to as public servants. Although I'm not so sure I've seen many that look like Jesus, who are more focused not on being served, but on serving. And for that matter, I'm not sure that my first inclination is to look for opportunities to serve. It was a long time ago when I had the last opportunity to look for a church to join. But since I didn't go to seminary until my mid-30s, I did have that experience of being a young parent looking for a church for the family. And the sort of questions that my wife and I asked when we looked at a prospective church were, did we like the worship and the preaching? Was the music good? What about the programs for the children? Was the nursery attractive, inviting? Were there interesting events and activities to get to know people? Did we like the people we met? It was a long time ago, but I'm reasonably certain I didn't ask the question, what are the opportunities here for me to serve others? I'm almost certain I didn't ask that. I was mostly focused on what the church might provide for me and my family. My calculations about how to pick a church to join were really not so different than the calculations anywhere else in life. They were about what's in it for me and mine. Do I like it? What will my family get out of it? What will I get out of it? And perhaps there's nothing wrong with such questions. But if those are the only questions that I and most everybody else in a congregation are asking, what's the chance that it'll be a place where people learn to be like Jesus? To come not to be served, but to serve. Now, I should add that there were people in this congregation who were focused on serving rather than being served. And some of them had a great deal to do with me coming to a different understanding about church and about myself, and eventually about going to seminary. I wonder if James and John and the other disciples are still asking what's in it for me type questions as Jesus prepares to enter Jerusalem. They've been with Jesus for a long time, but they still struggle to understand him, to emulate him. Perhaps they can't fully understand him until the cross and the resurrection. I think most of us struggle to understand Jesus, much less to emulate him. It's just too hard. Jesus asks too much of us. You know, people will speak of America as a Christian nation, but I wonder if that's not mostly a matter of affiliation and habit. Surely it's not because most Americans have figured out how to follow Jesus, how to be like him. That's really not all that surprising. Much of what Jesus says and asks is completely contrary to the way the world works. He says exactly that when he speaks to the disciples about how the Gentiles act. Gentiles was a term that referred to anyone who wasn't one of them, wasn't a Jew. And so it can basically mean the world. Yes, the world is this way, says Jesus, but it is not so among you. Ah, but it is so among us, just as it was with James and John. At least we're in good company. We're a lot like those first disciples. We struggle with the idea that being a servant of all, loving your enemies, being last of all, is the way to go. We're just not sure we can trust this way of Jesus. I wonder if we don't do well simply to own that, to admit that. To cry out with a father in Mark's gospel who wants his child to be healed and says, I believe, help my unbelief. Because the fact is, we're never going to get talked into or explained into following the path of Jesus. We can't do it without help. We need Jesus to keep teaching us. We need the Spirit to empower us. We need God to open our hearts to a way that just feels wrong, but that Jesus assures us is the way of life. Jesus, I hear you calling me to a way that the world does not recognize, a way that the world thinks foolish. I want to follow. Truly I do. But I struggle. I believe, but help my unbelief. Help me, Jesus. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus to show us the way of life. Thanks be to God.